Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, and welcome to another weekend book review. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We've noticed a lot of you are tuning in, which is amazing, but I haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet.
Yeah, and that little button, honestly, it's so small, but it makes such a huge difference in helping us reach more people with these important discussions.
Right. It's true. Like the algorithms, those mysterious forces that decide what we all see and hear, they pay a lot of attention to subscriber numbers.
Yeah, think of it like the subscribing. It's like casting a vote for quality content, So these insightful research discussions don't just get lost in the sea of all the information out there.
More subscribers equals more visibility. Right. And that means more resources for us to make even deeper dives for you.
Yeah.
Maybe bring in experts for interviews, even do some live Q&A sessions where you can jump in.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about building a community around research,
Yeah.
where curiosity thrives and knowledge is like shared and debated.
So today we're going deep, literally a deep dive into this whole world of modern Chinese foodways, based on those intriguing book excerpts you shared with us. And when we talk modern, we're really looking beyond just the dishes you might see, in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, spot on. These sources really shed light on how Chinese food has been, reshaped in a fundamental way by all sorts of forces in the contemporary world, the impacts of industrialization, technology, migration, even how our ideas about identity have evolved. And, getting a grasp on these changes in China offers a pretty critical lens for looking at culinary modernity on a global scale.
So this isn't just like, a dry history lesson, right? We're going to trace the journey of staple foods like millet, the unexpected rise of soy sauce, even how the digital age is changing our relationship with eating.
Right. We'll be exploring how scientific advancements, the movement of people, even this whole idea of culinary identity, how those have evolved in China.
All right, so our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is to equip you with a much richer, more nuanced understanding of Chinese foodways, to move past this notion of a static tradition and really explore the dynamism, the modern forces shaping it all. Let's unpack this, and I think a good place to start is with the grain that's played a surprisingly central role in Chinese history.
Millet. Millet really takes us back to the very foundations of Chinese civilization. For centuries, even before rice became the dominant grain, millet was really the bedrock of political, cultural, economic life in China.
Yeah, the sources talk about this significant millet belt stretching across the lowest lands of Shaanxi down into the Yellow River Plains. And it wasn't just farmland. This was the heartland of power.
Absolutely. The location of capital cities, the main source of tax revenue, the epicenter of the Chinese world. It wasn't until the fall of the Northern Song dynasty in the 12th century that rice really overtook millet as the defining grain.
So let's paint a picture here. What did a typical meal even look like back in these millet-centric medieval times?
Well, we get a pretty fascinating glimpse into that from the Kim and Yao-shu. It's this foundational text on agriculture from the 6th century. It describes how the staple food, or what they called fan, was Setaria millet. Typically, it was steamed or prepared as porridge. And to add flavor, both the rich and the less well-off relied on what they called relishes. So stews, soups with fresh or preserved vegetables, sauces, pickles, things like that.
And of course, the essential shit, right? Fermented soybean paste.
Exactly. She was vital. It was a cheap and flavorful way to really enhance those meals, making that precious salt go further. And we now know it provided a really valuable source of protein. So this basic diet, millet plus relishes, it was, pretty common across different social levels.
I mean, there had to be some pretty stark differences in what people ate, right?
Yeah.
In terms of quality, variety, all that.
Right. For the poor, it was largely a vegetarian diet. Cooking oil was a big luxury. And, instead of higher quality millet, the poorest families often had to resort to just boiled soybeans, which apparently could be pretty bitter and not very easily digested. On the flip side, the wealthy, they enjoyed a much more diverse diet. They'd have their own vegetable gardens, orchards, practice crop rotation, and they often kept livestock for meat and milk. So their stews, pickles, sauces, all those things would have been far more elaborate.
It's really striking how something as basic as grain was so deeply woven into the social and political landscape.
Oh, completely. Peasants would pay their taxes in millet and cloth, which in turn supported the state, the court, the army, the whole bureaucracy. And then the state, with their granaries full of that tax millet, played a crucial role in stabilizing prices and distributing grain when there were shortages. It was a kind of safety net for those same farmers.
Okay, now fast forward to the present day. It seems millet is making a bit of a comeback, at least in some areas.
That's right. In more marginalized communities in North China, like Kinzhou and Wangjinshuang, we're seeing this kind of economic and cultural resurgence centered on renewed millet farming.
And Wangjinshuang, that's the village famous for those impressive terraces, right?
That's the one. Those towering terraces, initially built through communal effort, were once seen as a symbol of, well, socialist ingenuity. But now they've become a pretty big tourist draw. With better road access, visitors are flocking to the area. Even the donkeys, which were once essential for farming, they've become a popular, photo op for the tourists.
It sounds like they're really leaning into the traditional, maybe even idyllic aspects of rural life.
Very much so. Wang Dekai, who had a successful electronics business, he returned to his village and was instrumental in setting up this association. They use online marketing to sell the local farmers' produce, really emphasizing that unique landscape and marketing their millet as, get this, peasant-grown and donkey-manured, really playing up that heritage appeal.
Okay. That's quite a tagline.
It is. And they even have what they call dragonhead enterprises, which are basically government-backed agribusiness firms designed to, stimulate those rural economies. They help develop products and markets.
So it's a tourism and kind of this artisanal heritage brand that are really driving Wang Jinshuang's revival. What about Kinzhou? They seem to be taking a different approach.
You're right. Their focus isn't on the unique farming methods, but rather on the specific type of millet they cultivate. It's called Kinzhuang, which basically means Kinzhou yellow or gold. And this variety has a long history, even imperial recognition. The Kangxi Emperor himself was said to be a fan of its flavor, called it the king of millets and golden pearls, and it's recognized for its health properties in traditional Chinese medicine.
So it's about a specific high-quality product with, a pedigree.
Exactly. Crop geneticists consider it to be one of the best traditional Soteria varieties, flavor-wise. And unlike Wangjinshuang, where they emphasize small-scale traditional farming, in Kinzhou, both small farmers and larger, more mechanized farms can sell their millet to processing plants, and that doesn't undermine its, authenticity in the national market. The focus is all on the inherent quality of that Kinzhuang millet itself.
So, two pretty different approaches to bringing millet back into the fold of modern foodways.
Yeah, for sure. Wangjinshuang is essentially selling an experience, a connection to the past through tourism, this romantic view of farming. Kinzhou, on the other hand, is selling a specific branded product, one with a reputation for excellence. It really highlights the different challenges and, the variety of strategies involved in trying to reintroduce older foods into our modern diets. And speaking of, foods that are deeply embedded in our culinary landscape, let's move on to a condiment that's ubiquitous today but has surprisingly murky origins. Soy sauce.
Soy sauce. It's hard to imagine Chinese cuisine without it, but you're saying its beginnings, at least as we know it, are sort of shrouded in mystery.
That's right. The first clear mention of the term jiangyu, which is, of course, soy sauce in any surviving text, appears in a 13th century recipe book meant for the elite. And the earliest known recipe for actually making it only goes back to 1360, found in a book on, I think, dietetics written by the famous painter Nizan.
Wow, that's way later than I would have guessed.
Yeah.
So what were people doing with fermented soybeans before that?
Well, if we look at Li Shizhen's comprehensive Benkao Gangmu, which is the compendium of materia medica from the 16th century, he talks about fermented soybean paste, or shi, and a liquid derived from beans called duyu. He even noted some medicinal properties associated with these fermented foods.
So maybe these were kind of earlier forms that eventually developed into the soy sauce we know today.
It's likely, but it wasn't until the Qing dynasty, which was 1644 to 1911, that we see a real jump in mentions of soy sauce. The Qing by Lei Chao, which is a vast compilation of, records about popular customs of that era, mentions soy sauce over 100 times, mainly in recipes. So this suggests that by the early Qing period, soy sauce had really become the go-to condiment in Chinese cooking.
And this growing popularity went hand in hand with the increasing commercialization of soy-based foods.
Definitely. As soy sauce became more readily available on the market, it allowed people to, in a sense, carry what they called the taste of home gupshang feng way with them. There's this really sweet anecdote about a scholar traveling to the capital for the imperial exams. He shared a pork stew flavored with soy sauce from his hometown with another scholar. And being away from home, that familiar taste brought them a lot of comfort. Another scholar official, a Lisserman, even wrote in his diary about how happy he was when he got a jar of sauce from his native Shaxing.
So it became tied to regional identity, this sense of belonging.
Exactly. And by the late Qing dynasty, soy sauce had gone from being mostly an elite condiment to, well, a commodity for everyday use, even though there weren't any really significant technological changes in its production until, the 1920s.
That's interesting. It's remarkable that such a big change could happen just through greater availability on the market. Do you think there were other competing condiments back then? Like, why this relatively late surge in popularity?
That's a really good question. So while, fermented soybean products had been around, the specific techniques, the flavor profiles that define what we think of as soy sauce, that probably took time to evolve, to refine. And then the rise of a more robust commercial system in the Qing dynasty definitely played a huge role in making it accessible to, a much wider population. As for competition, there were other fermented pastes and sauces based on different things. But soy sauce, with its umami richness, it might have offered this unique, versatile taste that just gradually won people over.
It really underscores how food is so interconnected with all these larger changes in politics and economics.
For sure. The transformation of soy sauce in the late Qing was really tied to the expansion of the soybean trade in Manchuria and to increased maritime trade, which of course made distribution and availability so much easier.
And then in the early 20th century, we start to see the influence of science coming into play, right?
Yes. A chemist named Wu Chenglu did this comparative study of regional soy sauces in 1924. And after that, biochemical methods started being integrated into food production. It marked the start of applying these, scientific principles to what had largely been a traditional craft.
So from kind of obscure beginnings to almost universal use, soy sauce's journey really reflects some pretty major changes in Chinese society, in commerce, even personal identity.
It's true. It shows how even a seemingly simple ingredient can undergo a profound transformation in the modern era, reflecting all those shifts in commerce, regional identity, and even the daily lives of the working classes. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to another food with a rich and multi-layered history.
Beef?
Beef in China. I know it hasn't traditionally had the same central place in the diet as pork or poultry. That's right. Beef in China is all about evolving meanings and consumption patterns, heavily influenced by everything from, pre-industrial practices to colonial rule and even political symbolism. We can even think about Fazi stewed beef as kind of an example of pre-industrial cattle chains. And Pingyao in Shaanxi province, they've got this deep-rooted tradition of beef consumption and trade in pickled beef, going back to the Ming Dynasty, all driven by, those enterprising Shaanxi merchants.
Pickled beef. That sounds like a way to preserve meat before, refrigeration was commonplace.
Exactly. And in Qingdao, the German and then later Japanese colonial periods had a real impact. They shifted the focus of cattle breeding towards producing quality beef for consumption rather than primarily for using them as draft animals. They even crossbred local Shandong cattle with imported breeds to develop cattle specifically for beef production.
Colonialism definitely left a lasting impact on culinary practices in so many parts of the world.
Absolutely. And then there's the political dimension of beef. Do you remember Khrushchev's goulash socialism? Mm-hmm. This idea that widespread access to meat was a sign of progress?
Vaguely. What was the take on that in China?
It was mostly seen as a kind of a deviation from revolutionary ideals, focusing on material comforts instead. The Chinese press at the time, they were pretty critical of it. That seemingly simple dish, braised potatoes with beef, tudu shaoniru, became a subtle symbol in those shifting political sands as China was, figuring out its own path.
Food is a political message. It's a powerful connection. Mm-hmm. So what happened after the planned economy era?
Well, after the Great Leap Forward, China's cattle production slowly recovered, and we start to see new beef products emerging with, the rise of entrepreneurship during the Reform era. Canned beef with brands like Mylan and Maling became pretty popular, especially for export. Different regions developed their own specialties like Inner Mongolian and Sichuan dried beef. Even Pingyao tried their hand at making canned luncheon meat for a bit before switching to vacuum-packed products.
And then there's the amazing rise of Lansu beef noodles. It's become a truly national dish.
Exactly. It started as this affordable, popular dish reflecting those low operating costs with simple setups in bus stations and roadside markets. But it gradually became more upscale. In 2010, it even received that official geographic indication or GI status, kind of like protected food names in Europe, legally protecting its origin as a brand.
So branding, regional identity, those played a big role in its evolution.
Absolutely. There was official promotion of food tourism focused on Lanzhou beef noodles. Even a Lanzhou beef noodle museum was established. And there were real efforts to elevate the business model with state-sponsored training programs for cooks and the promotion of, restaurant chains.
From humble street food to a national icon. Quite a journey. And then you have McDonald's entering the picture. That's a completely different kind of culinary influence.
Yeah, it is. The arrival of McDonald's and how it's evolved in China, from a special occasion thing to everyday convenience, really exemplifies what they call the McDonaldization of food production. That emphasis on standardization, efficiency, that global consistency.
So in a way, it's the opposite of Lanzhou beef noodles, which are striving for, that unique branded regional status.
Precisely. And if you look at the restaurant scene, while those global fast food chains have their place, hot pot or huguo remains dominant. And within hot pot, you have Kaoshan-style beef hot pot carving out its own niche by emphasizing the use of, fresh, never frozen beef, focusing on the quality, the specific cuts.
It's almost like each beef dish tells a story about China's modernization, its engagement with the world.
You could say that. The whole trajectory of beef consumption in China really demonstrates how technology, political ideas, economic reforms, and global culinary trends, they've all profoundly shaped what and how people eat, with different ways of preparing beef carrying very different social and cultural meanings. Okay, let's shift gears now away from the actual food itself, to a more abstract but no less important concept, the introduction and assimilation of vitamins into Chinese society.
Vitamins. Something we take for granted today. It's intriguing to think about how new that idea must have been at one point.
Oh, it was. There's this anecdote about someone mistaking cod liver oil for, get this, dog liver oil, which really shows how little people understood about the whole concept of vitamins. And this anecdote, it appeared in one of the very first articles to use the word vitamin in Chinese.
It must have seemed revolutionary at the time.
There was a real sense of hope in the 1930s that vitamin supplements could be the key to conquering malnutrition and, preventing these deficiency diseases. The idea was that if you ensured people were getting enough of vitamins A, B, C, and D, you could prevent serious illnesses and improve public health overall.
And where did this word vitamin even come from?
So a Polish biochemist, Casimir Funk, he came up with the term vitamin back in 1912. He combined vita, meaning vital, with amine, which refers to a type of chemical compound he thought was, essential for life. Then later, in 1920, Jack Cecil Drummond, he suggested shortening it to just vitamin because they discovered that not all these vital nutrients were actually amines.
And how did this Western scientific term make its way into the Chinese language?
Well, a few different transliterations emerged in the Republican era, starting around the late 1910s. The most common one was wei-taming, but you'd also see wei-taming and wei-tamine. They were, clever adaptations that not only sounded like the English word, but also used Chinese characters that had positive connotations.
So it wasn't just about understanding the science, but also about making this concept accessible linguistically, culturally, to the Chinese population.
Yes, exactly. And there was a fair bit of research done in Republican China to assess the vitamin content of Chinese diets, different foods. Scientists really worked hard to educate the public about the importance of vitamins, presenting it as this, crucial part of modern nutrition science.
Were vitamin deficiencies actually a widespread problem in China back then?
That's interesting. A 1937 report submitted to the League of Nations by a team of Chinese nutritionists, actually, suggested that obvious vitamin deficiencies weren't rampant among the rural poor. It's a finding that might, challenge some assumptions.
And of course, with a new scientific concept, with all these perceived health benefits, commercial opportunities followed.
Of course. Branded vitamin supplements started popping up in newspapers. They leveraged the authority of science while also drawing connections to traditional Chinese medicine. These ads, they often promised to prevent a whole range of illnesses. And, they could blend foreign and Chinese scientific and more traditional language really seamlessly. They fit right into the growing market for pharmaceuticals and health products. You'd see brands like Vitamin A Star brand claiming to be better than traditional fish liver oil.
So in a way, the concept of vitamins, it kind of rode the wave of the existing familiarity and perceived health benefits of cod liver oil.
Exactly. Cod liver oil had entered Chinese discourse earlier, through Western contact, and it was already seen as something that, promoted good health. Vitamins, they kind of inherited some of that positive association.
How did traditional Chinese medicine practitioners view this emphasis on isolated nutrients.
Well, traditional Chinese medicine had a very different take. Instead of focusing on deficiencies of specific nutrients, TCM emphasized dietary balance, moderation, and the whole relationship between how and what you eat, taking into account an individual's constitution and environment. They believed that diet-related illnesses often came from, irregular eating habits, particularly overeating. A prominent TCM doctor, Shi, even talked about how emotional states could impact digestion.
So it's a more holistic approach,
Yeah.
focusing on overall balance rather than the intake of specific components. It's really interesting to see these two distinct medical paradigms interacting.
It really shows how a Western scientific concept was received and incorporated into Chinese society, interacting with, those existing medical viewpoints and becoming part of this booming commercial market for health-related products. Now let's zoom ahead to a very 21st century phenomenon: food delivery and what they call the platform economy in urban China.
Yes, those ubiquitous delivery scooters. They're a defining feature of urban life in China today.
It's an industry that's exploded, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's all about this O2O online to offline model. Basically, it bridges that gap between online ordering and offline service and fulfillment, and it's heavily driven by tech giants like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu.
What would you say are the main factors behind this, this incredible growth?
A few things come to mind. The post-90s generation, people in their 20s and 30s now, they're a big part of the customer base. And you have societal shifts like, smaller families, increasing urbanization, and a large chunk of customers are single individuals. And interestingly, female customers are actually outnumbering men in using these services.
So it's clearly not just about convenience. It's become a real part of the fabric of urban life.
Yeah, absolutely. And it all hinges on this intricate network of interactions between people and technology. The apps, the algorithms that, manage delivery routes and times, the vehicles themselves, and the underlying communication networks. Biao-Sheng, who's an anthropologist, he describes the platform economy as a mobility business. What they're selling is the convenience of having someone else move on your behalf.
That's such an insightful way to put it. Someone else navigating the city for you.
Exactly. And during that Wuhan lockdown, remember, food delivery workers, they played a really critical role, providing essential supplies, a sense of normalcy to this deserted city. They even made deliveries to the medical teams on the front lines.
They were essential workers in the truest sense. But there's, of course, this other side to that convenience, right? The
Right.
impact on those same delivery workers.
Absolutely. These algorithms that power these apps, they prioritize speed and efficiency above everything else. So this creates huge pressure on the riders to meet these, often unrealistic delivery times. And that has a direct impact on their safety and their pay. They're actually incentivized to ignore traffic rules. Some riders even call it the inverse algorithm, where speed trumps safety, which unfortunately has led to more traffic accidents involving delivery riders in those big cities.
It sounds incredibly stressful and dangerous.
It is. Riders are constantly experiencing mental stress, and there's this sense of dehumanization because of the system's demands, the lack of flexibility in their work. And like Biao-Sheng points out, this hypermobility some people enjoy, it actually relies on the immobility of others, often deepening existing social inequalities. It particularly affects those rural to urban migrants who, make up a large part of the delivery workforce.
And it's changing the way we live, even our homes and cooking habits, right?
For sure. Real estate prices are going up, and that trend towards smaller apartments in cities, well, it means kitchens are becoming smaller, less important in many new homes. With less space for cooking and maybe less time or, just less desire to cook, people are becoming more and more dependent on food delivery for their meals. Developers are even designing apartments with smaller kitchens now.
But are we seeing any pushback against this, this reliance on delivery?
There is some, which is interesting, among some white-collar workers, some affluent housewives, especially those from the post-'80s generation. There's a growing interest in returning to the kitchen, experimenting with home cooking. It's sometimes driven by a desire for that authentic home flavor,
What about the environmental impact? All that single-use packaging, it must create a huge amount of waste.
It's a big concern. The sheer volume of plastic waste, plus the fact that it takes so long to degrade, it really clashes with the speed of delivery. The government's trying to curb plastic use with some new regulations, and organizations like Plastic Free China are pushing for recyclable containers. But it remains to be seen whether these efforts can keep up with the industry's rapid growth.
So food delivery is this incredibly complex thing, right? It's about convenience, labor issues, social inequalities, environmental concerns, even how we interact with our own homes and kitchens.
Absolutely. It's this human-non-human entanglement that's reshaping urban Chinese foodways in some pretty fundamental and often contradictory ways. Okay, so for our last section, let's explore how culinary identities are constructed and negotiated in modern China, focusing on gender, national identity, and ethnicity.
This sounds like we're getting to the heart of who gets to decide what counts as authentic Chinese food.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the most significant shifts has been the rise of cookbooks written by Chinese women for other women. For centuries, Chinese food writing was dominated by men.
So the people who were actually doing most of the cooking, their voices were, well, largely missing from the historical record.
That's right. But in the 20th century, we see the emergence of these pioneering female cookbook authors, like Cheng F.T., who wrote Musings of a Chinese Gourmet. She presented herself as a knowledgeable cook, a discerning eater, often focusing on teaching regional Chinese cuisines in places like Taiwan and the U.S. Huangyanshan. She also achieved a lot of commercial success in post-war Taiwan.
These women were really challenging the established order of culinary authority.
They were. And in Taiwan, how Taiwanese cuisine developed its own identity is a really interesting case study in national identity formation. During the Japanese colonial period, Taiwanese cuisine was intentionally set apart from mainland Chinese cuisine. Then after the Chinese Civil War, you had all these mainland Chinese cuisines coming in, which created this kind of condensed map of Chinese culinary traditions within Taiwan. And later, the indigenization movement, or Taiwanization, actively promoted local Taiwanese dishes. People like Fu Pei-mei, they were key in popularizing both Chinese and Taiwanese home-style cooking.
Food became a tool for defining and asserting a distinct Taiwanese identity.
Right. And ethnicity plays a fascinating role, too. Take, for example, that tourist spot in Hubei, Girl City in Enchi. They've created this tradition of smashing alcohol bowls as a way of building a Tujia ethnic identity and, of course, attracting tourists.
Invented traditions. Yeah. It all sounds quite deliberate.
It is. They've basically repackaged elements of Tujia culture for commercial reasons, even reinterpreting the traditional girls' festival, the Nuerhui. This bowl smashing, which seems to have started in the 1990s, it's become this ritualized way of building social connections and creating that lively, bustling atmosphere, or renao, that's so important in Chinese social gatherings.
So it's about creating an experience of ethnic authenticity, even if it's relatively new.
Yeah.
What about the people who write about food, the mishijia, the gourmets? How has that role evolved?
The whole meaning of food writing has changed a lot. In the 80s and 90s, literary portrayals of the mishijia often explored this tension between a love of food and the increasing professionalization of, culinary expertise. Later, you see this nostalgic focus on grandmothers cooking treasured childhood foods alongside the rise of internet celebrities like Li Ziki, who promotes this rustic gastronomy.
It's this constant negotiation of what makes good or authentic Chinese food in the modern world.
Exactly. And it extends to foreign cuisines, too. Japanese food, for instance, it's become a real part of the urban Chinese food scene, particularly in cities like Shanghai and Tianjin. And there's been this trend of domestication, corporatization of Japanese restaurants, a shift from, authentic Japanese ownership to more local ownership, adapting menus to suit Chinese tastes. It's interesting to compare this with how Chinese food has developed in the diaspora.
Like in California and Peru, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. In California, early Chinese migrants were mostly laborers and merchants from Guangdong, so Cantonese cuisine became the dominant form of Chinese food there. In Peru, you had indentured laborers who developed chifa, this unique fusion cuisine that uses local ingredients, like potatoes and tamarind. Chifa became a point of contact between different races, and even though it's widely accepted now, there's still this association with working class food.
So Chinese food in the diaspora takes on its own unique forms, shaped by the local ingredients and culture.
For sure. Even seemingly traditional family rituals are being reshaped by modern forces, things like migration. In the Man lineage in Santin, Hong Kong, those pork division rituals, once all about, patriarchal authority, they've become more about family reunions, networking, with women playing a much bigger role.
It's fascinating how gender, ethnicity, and national identity, how they all interact to shape what Chinese food is, what it means in this modern context.
It's definitely a dynamic, ongoing process.
This has been such an enlightening deep dive into modern Chinese foodways. We've covered so much ground, from the revival of ancient grains to the rise of food delivery apps, from the changing roles of women in the kitchen to the construction of ethnic identities through food. It really paints a picture of this incredibly complex and ever-evolving culinary landscape.
Yeah, I hope there were some surprising things in there for you. Maybe the fact that soy sauce is actually a relatively recent addition to the Chinese culinary scene, or the invented traditions around food and ethnicity. Those are pretty interesting, I think.
For me, it's the interconnectedness of it all that's so striking.
Yeah.
Economic shifts, technology, political ideas, cultural movement, they all leave their mark on what ends up on our plates. Understanding Chinese culinary modernity really gives us a valuable lens for looking at global food trends and culture more broadly.
It does. It makes you think about the future, right? What will Chinese foodways look like in the next few decades? How will this dance between tradition and modernity continue to, shape our diets and our identities? A lot to ponder, for sure.
Indeed. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.